Good morning and welcome to day 19 of our series. It's almost hard to believe that we're almost done. I appreciate the time that you have put into watching these videos, and I hope that you have learned something about psychological effects in Christianity. Today we're going to be talking about psychotic disorders. They are a group of serious illnesses that affect the mind. They make it hard for somebody to think clearly, to make good judgments, respond with appropriate emotion, communicate effectively, to understand reality. That's a big one. And to have appropriate behavior. Schizophrenia is the most well known psychotic disorder, and the symptoms of most of the other disorders are very, very similar. So I want to talk about schizophrenia, and we'll get a pretty good idea of what the other ones are about as well. When psychotic symptoms are severe, the individual may have trouble staying in touch with reality, and very frequently they simply cannot handle daily life. This group of illnesses can affect anybody regardless of their upbringing, social class, or personal faith. The good news is there are effective treatments in the form of medication and psychotherapy. About the same number of people who have epilepsy will have schizophrenia. Not both together, but it's about the same number of people in the population, epilepsy and schizophrenia, about the same number of people. There are some high risk groups. If a parent has schizophrenia, the child is at a higher risk. Of course, if there's a family history at all, there's a higher risk. An interesting risk factor is if the father of the child is over 50 at the time of birth of the child, that child is at a higher risk for schizophrenia. And then there are certain groups, and we really don't know why. But there are certain groups that are prone to schizophrenia. For example, Afro-Cubans in the United Kingdom and first and second generation immigrants. Children of dry cleaners are at a high risk for schizophrenia. There is a peak time for schizophrenia to first present itself, and that's between the ages of 20 and 24. Women tend to have an earlier onset and greater severity of symptoms. After the age of 35, the number of males developing schizophrenia decreases, but the number of women do not. The criteria for schizophrenia, as I said a moment ago, is pretty much the same criteria for the other psychotic disorders. So I'll cover this and we'll apply it to the other disorders as we need to. To have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, you have to have at least 2 or more symptoms, and at least one of those symptoms have to be delusions, hallucinations, or delusions that are not exclusive to schizophrenia. Disorganized speech, disorganized behavior, and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are those things that are added to the person. For example, a delusion or a hallucination. That would be a positive symptom, not because it's a good thing, but because it's added to the person. A negative symptom would be having a flat affect or not being able to attend to activities of daily life, being stuporous. In other words, something has been removed from the individual. That's the difference between positive and negative symptoms. Now, for a significant portion of time since the person started having psychotic symptoms, their functioning has to be severely affected. And for a diagnosis of schizophrenia, you have to have continuous symptoms for at least 6 months. Now that's an important time delineator, and I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. The clinical presentation of schizophrenia, you have delusions. We've spoken about that in past videos, but a delusion is simply a false belief. It's believing something that's not true. The word delusion comes from the Latin word ledere, which means to play tricks on the mind. A hallucination, we've spoken about hallucinations in the past as well, but a hallucination is nothing more than a sensory experience in the absence of perceptual stimuli. There's some more psychobabble for you. What that means is you can taste things that you're not eating. You can smell things that aren't there. You can hear voices that aren't real. Any of your 5 major senses can have a hallucination attached to it. The disorganized speech, it can be people just talking and not really making a whole lot of sense, or they can just simply make up words. The behavior can be disorganized where the movements don't make a whole lot of sense. The catatonic behavior, catatonia, is not really well understood by most people. Most people think that catatonic behavior means that the person is stiff and rigid. That's not all that catatonic behavior is. If somebody's catatonic, they're flexible, they have a movement, but if somebody is presenting with their arms like this, I can move their arm, but what would happen is the arm would go back to it. That's one type of catatonic behavior. The other type of catatonic behavior is wild flailing and not being able to control themselves. Now that's pretty much what schizophrenia is. There are other psychotic disorders such as schizoaffective disorder. This is where you have the features of schizophrenia and a mood disorder, depression, or bipolar disorder. And it makes a difference what happens first. If you have psychotic symptoms and then a mood disorder, that's schizoaffective disorder. If you have a mood disorder like bipolar, and then you have psychotic features, well, that's bipolar disorder with psychotic features. But schizoaffective, you have the psychosis first, and then a mood disorder is superimposed on it. Schizophreniform disorder is where you have psychosis for at least a month, but less than 6 months. That's where that time limitation I spoke about a few moments ago comes in. People can have psychotic type symptoms, but if it's not at least 6 months, it's not schizophrenia. People can have delusions by themselves without the other stuff going on. That would be a delusional disorder. And a delusion is an idiosyncratic belief or impression that's firmly maintained despite being contradicted by what's generally regarded as being real or rational. The person who has a delusional disorder can have absolutely normal behavior other than that delusion. And the delusions have to be a month or longer. A brief psychotic disorder is when somebody has very sudden onset of psychotic behavior, but it may only last a few days, less than a week. And very frequently, a brief psychotic disorder is triggered by stress. An interesting disorder is called shared psychotic disorder. It's also referred to as folie à deux. In this, you have a person who begins to have a delusion, and then other people who are close to that person begin to buy into that delusion. It could be that it's the same delusion. Somebody might believe that there are space aliens that are spying on them, and then somebody else in the family begins to believe the same thing. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could be, for example, somebody believes that they are a CIA agent and they're on secret missions, and then somebody else in the family becomes their controller or handler. They buy into the delusion, but it's not exactly the same. It's a really interesting phenomenon, and it can spread to the entire family. Those are the main psychotic disorders, but what causes it? Well, there's a genetic component. In in identical twins, the rate of both twins having schizophrenia is about 28%. Children of people of an identical twin that is well, that in other words, they don't have it, so the parent does not have schizophrenia, but the child of that person who has an aunt or uncle, the rate of schizophrenia goes up. So genes play an important part of schizophrenia, but it doesn't explain everything about why some people develop schizophrenia. In all likelihood, there are multiple genes that work together in order for schizophrenia to come about. There are some really interesting prenatal exposures to developing schizophrenia. In the northern hemisphere, people born in the wintertime between January and March, they have a higher rate of schizophrenia. That's interesting. What is it about the wintertime that causes children to have schizophrenia? If the mother of the child has a prenatal viral infection, that increases the risk of schizophrenia in children. For example, in 1957, there was a flu epidemic in Finland where the rates of people having schizophrenia were much higher if the mother was sick in the second trimester of her pregnancy. There's also rhesus incompatibility, the Rh factor thing. If there's blood incompatibility between the mother and the child, that increases the risk of schizophrenia. If there's early nutritional deficiencies, that may increase the risk of schizophrenia. But we don't know if it's a general lack of nutrition or a specific nutrient. During World War II, the winter of 1944 to 1945, there was what is called the Dutch hunger winter. It was a famine that took place in the Netherlands, and children who were conceived at the height of the famine had a 2 times higher rate of developing schizophrenia than children conceived at a different time. If there are perinatal birth complications, there's a high risk of schizophrenia, particularly if the complication reduces oxygen content for the baby. A breech delivery or a prolonged labor, or if the cord is wrapped around the child's neck, those all increase the risk of schizophrenia developing later in that child's life. If there is an injury to the brain during early development, that may also result in schizophrenia. But an interesting statistic is almost 90%, 89% of people who have schizophrenia do not have a first or second degree relative that also has schizophrenia. So schizophrenia can simply pop up. It's scary to think about that. There have been researchers that have gone back and found out that there is pre-schizophrenic behavior as young as 2 years old. What they did is they got home movies and videos of people who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia later in life. And this is relatively recent because, stop and think about it, how long have we had home movies? Probably 50 years, maybe, or on a large scale. But in children as young as 2 years old, They had stereotypical movements that were odd. As young as 2 years old, the researchers were able to say, yep, there it is. Now, we don't pay a whole lot of attention to that because 2-year-old toddlers are running around doing 2-year-old toddler things, and we don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. But these researchers were able to go back and look at these home movies and say these are behaviors that are typical for somebody developing schizophrenia later in their life. There is also a biological feature. I was able to do this the other day, so I'm going to try it again. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to share the screen. Here we go. There we go. And this is an MRI of twins. The ventricles is in the brain. That's where the cerebral brain fluid is made. And this is a healthy twin. You see the ventricles are much smaller. Here there are enlarged ventricles. Now, why schizophrenics have enlarged ventricles, we really don't know, but we do know it happens. There's a neurochemistry that's associated with developing psychosis. Mental changes that are associated with LSD, for example, prompted interest in looking at the biochemistry of schizophrenia, because people who are taking LSD, they develop a psychosis. And what the researchers found out, that there seems to be something about dopamine that causes hallucinations. Now, dopamine cannot be directly measured in the brain, but patients with schizophrenia have higher dopamine than people who do not. And we know this through autopsy. It's about the only way to do it. The dopamine receptors in different parts of the brain, there are more of them. So there seems to be something about dopamine that has something to do with hallucinating. There are also some psychosocial and cultural factors. It used to be thought that bad parenting, particularly by the mother, caused children to become schizophrenic. That theory has been debunked. That is not true, but that was believed for a long time. However, in families where there is a lot of tension, there is a higher rate of schizophrenia, and there's a higher rate of relapse for people whose schizophrenia has remitted. The expressed emotion within the family is how family members speak about the person with schizophrenia. If people are critical about the person who has schizophrenia, or if they're hostile toward them, this causes a higher rate of relapse. Interestingly, to me at least, urban living has a risk factor of 2.75, almost 3 times higher than not living in an urban setting. And this causes us to think that there might be environmental factors such as stress. Stress may lead to a higher release of cortisol, which triggers dopamine release, and that may, this is all a theory, that may trigger psychotic behavior. Another interesting risk factor is immigration. Recent immigrants have an increased risk of schizophrenia. With first generation immigrants, it's about 3 times higher. A second generation, or the child of the person who immigrated, is 4.5 times greater than somebody who is not an immigrant. Immigrants that have black skin have a higher rate than immigrants that have white skin. Don't know why. We just know it happens. that may suggest that the stress involved in discriminatory behavior against that darker skinned person leads to paranoia and suspiciousness, which then sets the stage for developing schizophrenia. Healthy people who feel discriminated against are more likely to develop schizophrenia than people who are not. And heavy users of marijuana, people who smoke a lot of dope, are 6 times more likely to develop schizophrenia than people who don't smoke marijuana. That's the overview. Let me tell you about treatment. About 38% of people who have schizophrenia recover within 15 to 25 years after their diagnosis. Now, that's a long time to be sick, but the good news is people who develop schizophrenia can get better. There's really good pharmacology or medicine for people who are having psychotic symptoms. The first generation was Thorazine and Halidol. That worked fairly well, but there were a lot of side effects such as being drowsy, weight gain, involuntary movement. You may have seen commercials on TV now. They're advertising medicine for tardive dyskinesia. That's movement that is involuntary caused by the medication, long-term use of medication for psychosis. And it could be tongue thrusting, licking your lips. It could be a jerk. All of those are side effects, and the tardive dyskinesia, the medication for it is supposed to lower those side effects. Second generation, these are the atypical neuroleptics. I talked about these the other day when I was talking about bipolar disorder. Risperidol, Zyprexa, Seroquel, Geodon. Those are good for both positive and negative symptoms of psychosis. And interestingly enough, they block receptors, the dopamine receptors in the brain. Psychotherapy is effective, but it's more effective if somebody's taking medication. All right, so that's the overview. But how am I going to be able to relate this to what we find in the Bible? Well, psychotic behavior is not directly mentioned in the Bible, but the ancients were at least aware of it. David, when he was fleeing from Saul, took refuge with Achish, who was the king of Gath, and you might recall that Goliath was from Gath. David's running away from Saul, and he goes and he takes refuge, and the servants of Gash told him who David was. And so David had to escape again, and to do so, David faked being psychotic. Really? Yeah, really. 1 Samuel 21, verses 10 through 15 says this. Then David arose and fled that day from before Saul, and went to Achish the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, Is this not David the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Verse 12. Now David took these words to heart, and was very much afraid of Achish the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, pretending madness in their hands. He scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, Look, you see the man's insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I not enough madmen that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? So, the people in the Old Testament at least knew enough about mental illness to recognize it when they saw it. Although the Bible does not specifically address the brain or psychological problems, it does refer to people being healed of all sorts of illnesses. The Lord works not only through miracles, but also through medication, surgery, counseling, and changes in the environment. He doesn't want anybody to remain in hopeless suffering, and he calls to all to come to him with their burdens to find a better life. Matthew 11:28 and through 30 says this, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden light." God cares about us. God knows all there is to know about us. Jeremiah 29:11 gives me hope. I really like this verse in the Bible. It makes me know how much God cares about me. This is what God said in Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." That's what I made to hope. God cares about us. He wants us to have a future, and he wants us to have a future that we are in good health. I'm going to leave you with this today. 3 John chapter 1 verse 2 says, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health just as your soul prospers." God wants us to be healthy and prosperous. So that's our video for today. I hope you found something that you can take from this. God bless you. Remember, you're loved. We love you. God loves you. Go with God. Have a great day. And I'll talk to you again tomorrow.